So I've been watching the price of silver lately. In 20, I think it was 2011 or so, there was a big run up on the price of silver, which we haven't seen those highs in quite some time, but there has been some renewed interest in the price of silver from a bunch of different places. I think there was a Wall Street Bets was very famous in the whole GameStop saga. And then there was like a copycat thing that got created, which was Wall Street Silver or something like that. And there were a bunch of people who started buying silver, speculated that this is another attempt to try to get this famously short paper situation unraveled to the detriment of those who have been shorting silver. We've seen silver actually hit a 14-year high recently, so it topped out at like $34 last week and still kind of on the rise. Lucas, how much do you keep track of silver? I know Argentina is always foremost in your mind when I ask you about silver.
I keep track of gold and silver on my peripheral as I keep an eye on the international currencies. And I think it's a big problem that one country supplies the currency, the paper, um, for the rest of the world to denominate their currencies in. And uh, and part of the reason that it gets away with doing so is because it captured a lot of the world's gold at one point in time. So I think that the price of silver rising, the price of gold rising, has more so to do with a a rebalancing, a lack of faith in the dollar by the world, and we certainly know that to be a fact by the creation of the BRICS alternative dollar system. So, but meanwhile, I think that those people who are part of the dollar hegemony, uh, individuals who are part of that, and individuals and institutions, but maybe not the central banks, are becoming leery of the prospect of the United States to be able to settle its debt problem. And
And this is the BRICS. This is the major BRICS development that happened last week, where we've now got a card that you can use and some kind of a settlement layer that allows you to pay with the BRICS currency.
yeah, and not only this, but also BRICS has is put out a paper last week. I'm not sure how far along it is, but it was about cross border payments. And BRICS is sort of building towards this notion of an international trade system. But in the meantime, um, more countries are signing on to it. The United States has sanctions all around the world. Politicians here in the United States are continue to hold the narrative that we can um, that we have some sort of ability to force nations to use our currency, and there has been a lack of an alternative apart from gold and silver in the past. But other countries have long been aware of that and have been looking for to make that alternative. And the Russia put out a paper, which unfortunately I got the PDF of it, but it was in Russian, so I had to rely on a couple of different translations of it. But it goes into depth talking about something called decentralized ledgers. I wasn't sure what that was. Um, sounded a
Or
lot like block.
decentralized ledgers. So, yeah, it sounds a lot like a blockchain.
Yeah, they were very careful not to say blockchain, but they talked a lot about decentralized ledgers, and maybe at some point they did talk about blockchain or and crypto. I know that XRP was mentioned in the paper, but it was quite obvious they were talking about blockchain and um, and how to move over to digital currencies in one part, the dreaded CBDCs for in a country, what that would be bound to, and then how that would look as uh, as they you know they use that as the basis for their swaps with other nations. So I think what's going on with gold and silver has everything to do um, with the transition that's going on in international trade right now.
The weaponization of the US dollar, the way that the US started to push their own empire narrative, the way that it was used against countries to take wealth back. I think Russia, when the Ukraine war conflict broke out, this was a lot of the money that was in the US based system was seized or whatever. And I think that that was the probably the final instigator that really pushed this over the line was the weaponization of the dollar. Like when you're saying you can't force countries to use it, but even worse than that, if they are using it and then you use it in a way that isn't benign, if it isn't, like pushing the empire narrative, then I think that's when you really get people looking for this alternative.
And not only have we sanction, and Russia may have been one of the first. Actually, I think Iran was one of the first countries that we sanctioned. It was probably for um, the Iran Contra affair, the taking of the hostages in Iran, what, in 1979, as the Americans were globally unaware that it was our State Department through the CIA that had created um, uh, the revolution that occurred in Iran at the time. But now we've stepped that up. We have hundreds of countries in the world that we have placed sanctions on, and countries like Iran, Russia, um, Venezuela, those countries that don't that aren't towing the American line. We have the most draconian sanctions on. So, um, the other thing that we have seen is in order to sustain this and to provide money to the rest of the world, we sell treasuries. The dollar is not printed or just printed. We write down a piece of paper that we owe you this much and we'll pay you at this time in the future, and that's how money is created. And China was a great purchaser of United States treasuries, other countries also. But did you know that the largest purchaser of treasuries is now a little crypto bank called Tether?
Yeah, I've been watching that. I think the highest holder was Japan, right? Wasn't it the Bank of Japan that was holding a significant amount of treasuries? But yeah, Tether's been really growing as far as how much they're holding in treasuries. It's just starting to look like crypto is the bailout to the dollar in some fashion.
Well, I'm not sure where Japan sits. I just saw article, a headline of an article, that that Tether had for the last year was the largest purchaser of United States Treasuries, and it raised my eyebrows and caused alarm because Tether isn't a country. Tether doesn't have an economy. Tether is a crypto bank, and um, that seems to me to be a much more precarious system than relying on the ability uh, of other countries to create, produce, mine, extract, um, whatever it may be to sustain that debt. And if it's just a crypto company, gosh, that sounds to me to be very, very unstable. So, um, and I'm not sure where Japan is on that, but we have a strong alliance with Japan and Japanese industry, and that has everything to do with the World War II. Um, we we we're, we've had a lot of support that we injected into Japan following World War II, to create economy industry in Japan. And um, and when we set up the international finance regime, the IMF and the World Bank, we made Japan and Great Britain outsized holders, outsized against both their size and their populations. And we did so with an expectation that they would be strong partners and have a lot in common with the United States and how we wanted the world financial system to run in the future. So no surprise there.
Here's a little blurb on it. It's pretty high. I mean, that's quite substantive. Was that something trillion? So that's a pretty substantial amount of U.S. Treasuries.
Yeah, and if you recall back, we had I don't know what to call it. We had fluctuations in Japan's currency, um, instability in Japan's currency um, with the Nikkei index earlier this year, and um, I'm not sure what all was going on there, but there seemed to be the line at the time was that had to do with arbitrage with the United States dollar. Um, uh, International currency arbitrage. It had to do with the rising rate of the federal funds index. So wow, 81 billion in treasury bills. So that's a crypto
Yeah,
company.
less than Japan, but
Okay.
getting substantively up there.
Well, that it's a crypto company with what, 30 employees, that posted what, five times the profit that JP Morgan did, in the last year. So, isn't that interesting?
Very interesting. It's definitely an interesting thing when you can create something which doesn't have a whole lot of operational cost because it's mostly just running on a blockchain that you don't have to pay any of the infrastructure for. The only thing Tether really has to do is manage the assets and not make a mistake about how much it's issuing and try to keep the books balanced and then get those assets out there working for them. And if all they're doing is buying T-bills, well, that's fairly straightforward.
There's also, apart from what's going on with the sale of treasuries, there's been the Deaton Elizabeth Warren race, which I thought was interesting, as we see not just crypto on the lips of politicians, but also a higher level of understanding. And it certainly looks like John Deaton is not going to win in Massachusetts. Um, but the level of understanding, uh, and fervor for the use of blockchain, of Bitcoin, of crypto that Deaton brings to the table, I find interesting. And Elizabeth Warren too. When I think of Elizabeth Warren, I think that she is most motivated to control the banking and the finance systems. Um, I don't know how I don't know how well her solutions work. Sort of like using sanctions to perpetuate the use of the dollar throughout the rest of the world. Maybe that doesn't necessarily work. I don't know that the to me the
It might have worked in times past. I mean, there was definitely a world system where Elizabeth Warren's ideas and these things could have worked, but I think given BRICS, given Bitcoin, given some of the other things that are happening in the world, it's probably not the kind of thing that can work anymore, at least not the way she wants it to.
Well, what I see as a problem with the solutions by more traditional politicians like Elizabeth Warren, with more regulation and uh, and the heavy thumb the strong arm of the federal government being used uh, to keep an eye on finance and banking is that it doesn't it doesn't change that we have given the our banking and finance over to a monopoly. We never see politicians that question, if the federal government is so concerned with the creation of monopolies, why doesn't it end the monopoly that's been given over to the Federal Reserve? Because the Federal Reserve is a private bank. It's not a central bank. But it works as a central bank would. And the when the United States, when created, was created without a central bank. It's the oldest fight, or the second oldest fight, in the United States. And giving the banking system over to a monopoly has not worked out well. And it has over and over created institutions that are, quote, too big to fail. This was the problem with railroads. It was before we had this monolithic quasi central bank. The monopolies were run by by the different states, and there was some sort of idea that creating a central banking system, a central finance system, was going to stop the problems of states having monopolies. But at least at one time in our past, the states were pitted against each other. Now it seems like we just wait for the government to pick a point at which what is being done, what is being done by industries. And I'm thinking right now about Google, about Facebook, about our tech industries, but even our pharmaceutical industries, all industries. We've gotten away from, small business anymore doesn't mean small by employees, it means small by owners. And it seems that the same owners own all of the businesses. Um, and the only owning that anyone gets to do is through their 401k or through investments. And I think that's a problem. I think that crypto is the greatest threat to that monolithic structure. But I I it, I'm amazed, say, like, listening to John Deaton and Elizabeth Warren debating, that part of the narrative isn't questioning these more traditional politicians and asking, if you're so against monopolies and you're so much for government regulation, then why is it okay for the federal government to create a monopoly instead of a central bank?
Yeah, the last time I remember that being substantively in the political discourse and narrative was when Ron Paul was running for president. His whole "end the Fed, audit the Fed." Those were the last times that I remember that being a part of the substantive political discourse.
When Ron Paul was talking about it too, it certainly seemed much more out in left field. But I thought he was right then. I think he's right now. But part of the problem that that Ron Paul had was describing the alternative future that we were to see. And now, as we have, not, tethers and bricks and um, other alternatives that are being created, I think that that people can begin to understand what a future that doesn't rely on a monolithic denominator begins to look like. And I think, going back to what we started this conversation about, when silver and gold begin to pump, I think that is a sign of people beginning to understand that it is not the monolithic, or the monolithic dollar is not going to last that much longer. And 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 if that's the case, then I don't know how much it matters as to, what the amount of gold and silver are in the world, and how much are held by central authorities. Like, people are looking to diversify against the dollar. And as we also continue have a federal government, an executive, whatever part that it comes from, that seems to think it okay, and the people of the United States like have no recourse to the magical creation of billions and billions and trillions of dollars. Um, at some point, then whatever the alternative is going to be, people are going to be looking to hold other things than just dollars that they get from their job.
This was an interesting site that you pointed me at, this Atlantic Council dollar dominance thing. As much as we're starting to see how much, it's being drawn down as a exchange reserve, but it's still very high as far as it being used as the medium of exchange.
Yeah, and look at the graph on the right, or the whatever odometer, the um, I don't know what we call it, the 88.
Visualization metric, yeah.
Yeah, the metric. Oh, I was trying to think of what you call it on your dashboard, your rheostat. Um, 88% of transactions, of foreign exchange transactions, are denominated in dollars, and I think that's maybe the most important, because we talk a lot about countries holding these reserves, but they need to do so because they need to be able to buy wheat when they're out of wheat, buy cars whenever they want to import cars that are made from China, Japan, the United States, wherever it may be, Mexico. Um, and so this is the reason that they hold dollars in reserve, so they can turn around and buy this. But as going to this Russia paper that was released a week ago, this has also been something that the BRICS countries have been trying to figure out. And part of what they've been doing are creating commodity swap agreements, um, agreements to swap or to buy certain things in the currencies of the different institutions. But you turn around and you talk to economists, or just listen to economists, or listen to the economists of the Federal Reserve, or the politicians behind the likes of central banks, the European central banks, these Western dollar system bureaucrats. Then they say, well, this is you know th- what is occurring with BRICS is has always been inevitable, and maybe with a little bit, they'll maybe ascent towards crypto. Um, but they say that it's going to take a while. I don't know that it's going to take a while. I think that once the structure gets laid, that this this transition from using dollars to trade between countries, I think it is going to look more like a it's not going to be a linear shift. And once.
I agree. I think it's the kind of thing where it's slow and people have been watching for something like this to happen. Then, as we've seen Bitcoin, BRICS, we've got this, weaponization of the dollar. We have countries starting to move away from it. We've got the Japan carry trade starting to blow up. It's all these things starting to come together to lay the fertile field for this to actually occur. I think that the consequences of this are going to be profound. I was also taking a look at this paper that was written by the European Central Bank about the distributional consequences of Bitcoin. It's really interesting to see major institutions starting to consider and look at Bitcoin and take up positions on not just the distribution, but this as a technology. I think this distribution of Bitcoin is something that you've talked to me about when we've discussed this, not necessarily on the show, but I'm eager to have a bit of this conversation now as to what it means for all of this Bitcoin to be distributed out. I think 97% of all Bitcoin is already in the hands of the people that have been involved in it from an early phase.
Yeah, and what this paper is pointing out is something that we may have mentioned here before, but it has to do with the limited supply of Bitcoin. and how if there's a limited supply of Bitcoin and nobody is in control of what that supply is, and the rates going in and out, well, the early adopters of Bitcoin got it at a much cheaper price, and the Bitcoin system privileges them more so than anyone who is coming to Bitcoin now. So what did you think when you saw it? And maybe, I like to bring it back to Monopoly and say, imagine there was a Monopoly game in which the supply in the bank was limited, and you go and sit down at the game and all the money from the game is gone. You look over and there are $3 there, and people say, no, this is fun, it's fair. Sit down at the game, and all you have to do is roll the dice and play around the board, and you will become part of that system, this system. So
Well,
I think,
it just makes me wonder, like, if it's really all that different from the game that's already set up. I mean, where are we at with dollars? I mean, who holds all the dollars? Certainly isn't your average plebiscite that sits down to the table when they become, 21, 22 years old, recently graduated from college and ready to start making a few bucks. Like, the distribution of dollars is probably even worse than what it is for Bitcoin, and it's in the hands of deeper institutional corporate interests that are probably far not aligned. I've seen some distributional charts that say mostly the people that hold Bitcoin are rank and file, or people who would traditionally have not been somebody who could amass a gigantic amount of wealth. And a lot of that even has been speculated that it was lost because at the early days of Bitcoin wasn't worth anything. So there's an interesting area of research to try and figure out what really is the distribution of Bitcoin. And the other thing that I get thinking about is there are a lot of things where early adopters and early insiders trading in something are reap outsized rewards. If you think about any stocks that have some significant rip, like I don't know, maybe Apple or Nvidia, if you got in early on one of those stocks, you were profoundly outsizedly rewarded for that activity versus somebody who comes in much later and buys that stock and maybe sees a 10 to 15% depreciation over some amount of time. You're not going to get that 10x, 100x that you did if you invested in Tesla before it first squeezed.
well, I um good points. When I hear the the narrative that comes from the central banks, and even the Minneapolis, I don't know if you saw the paper from the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, um, that was talking about some of these same instances or same issues, not instances, issues. I thought it was interesting that they point out these problems about the distributional consequences of Bitcoin, and yet they pretend that the system that exists already is better. At least with Bitcoin, it begins to solve some of these issues, because you're 100% right that, how where does somebody who is joining the economy in whatever country that they live in the world today, in where is that working for them? Is it working in America? Is it working in the disparity of the international system that is denominated in America's currency? It doesn't necessarily work for Americans, and it doesn't work for the rest of the countries of the world. So why are we continuing to rely on a system in which the rates fluctuate and are controlled by a class of priests that we call whatever, central bankers, financiers, or investors? And so I think that the holders of Bitcoin, the early adopters, and those coming to it now as a promise for an alternative future are right. But what I think what we're going to see, and is an understanding that there's a technology behind Bitcoin. There is cryptocurrencies, um, that that we can that we can use the rules that are baked into computer networks um, to replace our reliance on central bankers. and but it doesn't necessarily have to look like the Bitcoin. It doesn't have to be the same rules that are baked into that network. But they don't
It
want to have
reminds
that.
me. It reminds me of that podcast that you showed me with Steve Keen, where he was on Lex Fridman's show, and they started talking about different kinds of currency experiments that have happened, especially the one I don't know if you remember exactly where it is, but where they had the money that was date stamped, and if you didn't spend it by a certain time, it became invalid. Things like that make me think that there are ways to do limited style currencies, especially ones that promote local economies that don't have these same fundamental distribution issues because they're limited in scope. They have to be traded locally, and they're used to amongst people that are close participants in a geographical area.
That was I do remember that. It was a town in Austria. Um, and I don't know if you remember the full story of what happened with that, but it was the Austrian central bank that clamped down on them and said, "Oh, you can't be doing this. You need to be using our um, you need to be using the bankers' money, the central bank's money, because you um, yay you're yay you have figured out a way to encourage commerce to create economy in your city, but it's outside of our control, and we can't have that." And they so you know I think this is absolutely what we're going to see in the future is a towns, counties, countries that begin to experiment with different rules that they place into the networks. It's interesting to me that what we're talking about is a CBDC, and yet and I think that those members uh, you know of the banking class, the central banks, etc., that understand what the possibility of using networks, decentralized ledgers. Look at him, there's Steve King. Great interview.
Yeah,
Um,
well, I mean, we got to bring it up. We got to link it because this is such a this is such a fantastic interview that happened between him and Lex Friedman, and I think people are probably going to want to tune into that section. So I'll link it in the show notes.
Yeah, and even if anyone's listening to it, listen to Steve Keen early at the opening of the podcast. He gives a short history of economics, and he starts with physiocrats and talks and in a couple of sentences sums up the assumptions that are made by physiocrats, classical economists, uh, the kickback from the likes of uh, whatever from some particular economists of the classical school, and the creation of neoclassical economics, which are sort of the rules that most economists that we hear of today talk from. He also gets into modern monetary theory, the MMT movement, and I don't know, listen to it with an open mind. He talks about Marx too, and and I don't think that there's any necessarily one set of rules that is the correct set of rules. There are different ways of looking at the world, and but what we need to understand is that there is no one set of rules, and this acceptance of, say, Federal Reserve economists, neoclassical economists, and Milton Friedman as the only way to set up um, our our countries is we're limiting our possibilities when we do so.
Well,
But
it just gets me thinking about the way that you've pointed out that it certainly hasn't been the case that the US has been a monolithic currency over its entire life. There's been lots of different currencies. We've covered this extensively. The idea of having a local currency where people use it to trade amongst themselves at farmers markets and whatever. I remember seeing that when I was quite young in the weirdest magazine possible, an issue of Mother Earth News. These things are not new. They're certainly have been done. They've been tried extensively. There have been lots of different experiments with currencies. And so the fact that we've been using the dollar for so long as an international medium of exchange, that you could actually go into a lot of foreign countries and just spend your dollars and they just take them, that to me seemed like the not the norm, but something very different that hasn't really existed much on this planet except over what, that period of maybe 70 years or 100 years or so.
Yeah, and it may seem threatening to talk about, things like commodity swap agreements, and how do you actually figure out the value of something if it's fluctuating? But it was the way of the world for thousands of years, for antiquity to do so. And what we live in now is, I think, both a mirage, um, but there are countries, there, and bureaucrats, anyone who gets close to where the sausage gets made, whether that be sitting in government somewhere and going through the budgeting process, or becoming an economist and going to work in the banking system, being in finance, being a trader. I think that we all begin to feel or understand that part of this, I don't know, that it's more complex than just there's a certain number of dollars or there's a certain amount of gold that's out there. And um I don't know, I think that it is no coincidence that uh, the network of communication that we've made, the internet, computers, uh, BitTorrents, Bitcoin, Chia, cryptocurrency, has reopened this issue, because putting it in the hands of an oligarchy or of a selected few people in the world has hasn't solved it. It's not an issue that necessarily needs to be solved, but it's something um, that we want to be a part of, in understanding what the value of of things are, of our time is. So, um, anywho, as Bitcoin is the
Yeah.
answer, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Go ahead, Rusty.
No, sorry, that was me. I said Bitcoin is the answer. I was
No,
just
no,
trying.
I thought Rusty was trying to break in for a second. I thought I heard his mic go. Well, I think it's actually a good summation. This is something that's been on our mind. I think it's something we're thinking about as we're watching this take place. It seemed appropriate time to discuss and revisit these ideas, and to dissect them a little further, given what's going on with BRICS and then finally getting the thing launched. So it's certainly something to watch. Also, for everybody catching up on this, you really got to check out the price of silver if you haven't been looking at that. That's got profound consequences. I'll put a couple of extra links on there of some people talking about what this might mean. There are a lot of things that are set up as shorted against silver. So there's kind of a price that if silver crosses, you could see some wild things take place. So we'll have to just keep an eye on it, and we'll report back if we see it cross those number marks. But yeah, keep an eye on gold and silver because they're definitely making moves.
Before we close it out, did you happen to see that Ace Vale, in his Chia Twitter, like now, the if you pay a mojo to post something, and if people like it, you actually get paid.
I did
Um,
see that. That was kind of interesting.
and going back to this, to deflationary currencies rather than inflationary currencies, I thought, how interesting would it be if at the point whenever we, or Chia gets its payment channels, the L2s up and working, if you sign up a DID to a system like that, and you get, so many of the Twitter currency that are issued to you a day, but they don't last that long unless they are put into the economy of the system. And I think we're very quickly going to see those sort of concepts go into um, those sort of like complex internal monetary systems be part of, the Twitters, the Facebooks, the things the social economies that we participate in online. And from there, I think that people will.
Bringing the evaporating coin idea back and saying, is this possible to do this here and to have it be a part of the social economy? Kind of makes me think a little bit about how Reddit's got their karma thing. If this is similar to that karma, but it actually carries monetary weight because whatever you're tipping people or you're giving them some amount of this currency, then it only has this limited time duration. Be an interesting experiment.
Well, and yeah, it's when Reddit first came out with their Reddit Gold for the community. The problem that I think that they had, and the reason it didn't take off to a greater degree, was how did you have a market? How did you swap it? How did you trade that out for something else? But again, in cryptocurrencies, like they have built an ecosystem with the likes of swaps. She has offers. She has liquidity pools.
Yeah,
So
that's exactly the kind of financial rails you need to make something like that have longer term values. You've got to have some ways that it can be exchanged, some kind of an idea of liquidity pools. So yeah, the fact that all that infrastructure already exists within the world of crypto and Chia means that you can do a lot of the stuff that would otherwise be fairly difficult to pull off. I mean, if you think about what would it have taken for Reddit to make that, not only do they have to make something like Reddit Gold where they can sell it to one person, you can gift it to another, but then having a secondary economy that builds on top of that, it's some ways eating into that first sale thing that they might not have wanted to do. But the secondary thing might have just been like, oh, okay, well, now we have to actually build the system that allows people to do it. And it's not necessarily the prime directive of Reddit is to build some kind of a currency system.
the prime directive, how
The prime directive.
the prime directive, and there were probably great minds who could see all of this, but the problem was that the going back to the problem of governments and assigning a monopoly to our financial system that was going to be shut off. But now we know that there are solutions that can't be turned off, and so it can't be the ignorance of late or laziness of politicians that ruin our future. So exciting times. Everyone, when we hear about the quote unquote collapse of the dollar, do not wail and gnash your teeth, but look forward to a brighter future. I'll leave it at that. We'll see you tomorrow, Grant.
So yeah.